The gurney rattled to a halt beneath the fluorescent hum of the emergency ward, and Renee's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared at the sterile ceiling tiles. No words, no comfort, just the crushing weight of Min Jae's absolute authority as his men stood guard at the curtain's edge. The hospital staff moved with practiced efficiency, but Renee felt the intense, watchful gaze of the underworld like a physical shackle. Renee Williams, the wife of the city's most ruthless boss, reduced to a passive captive in a white medical gown. She was bracing for the pain of her injury when the curtain pulled back and a doctor entered. Neatly styled dark hair, a light blue surgical mask obscuring his face, and eyes that held an attentive focus. He looked down at his clipboard, then up at her, and the world went silent. The mask lowered just an inch, and Renee's breath hitched. Those were the eyes of the man from the hotel, the man she had used to forget her possessive cage for one forbidden night. "Do you know where it hurts, Mrs. Kang?" the doctor asked, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying an explosive recognition. Renee couldn't look away from his gaze, clinical, professional, and yet carrying the forbidden history that could get them both killed before the sun rose. Renee Williams had exactly 0 allies in this country, a fact she tried to ignore as she lay still on the well-lit hospital bed. The polished danger of her life and soul had always felt like a velvet noose, but tonight the noose had tightened. The minor car accident had been a terrifying blur, but the ruthless possessiveness of her husband, Kang Min-jae, had been the real trauma. He had arrived at the scene not with comfort, but with a calculated investigation into why she was driving alone. Now, the emergency ward smelled of antiseptic and ozone, cold and clinical against the lethal elegance of the world she usually inhabited. Renee scanned the ward through the gaps in the privacy curtains, noting the rhythmic, clinical professionalism of the nurses, a young intern checking a monitor, and the doctor standing at the foot of her bed, his profile sharp and striking, a ghost from a past she had tried to bury. Some people watch history, our viewers study it. Welcome to Afro-Korean Script with Maya. We have a long list of secrets to share, so hit that subscribe button to keep your clearance level updated. The fluorescent lights of the emergency ward hummed with a clinical indifference that made the silence in the room feel even more suffocating. Renee lay perfectly still, her neutral expression a mask she had perfected over years of being Mrs. Kang. But beneath the white medical gown, her heart was a frantic bird batting against its cage. At the foot of the bed, Dr. Han Jun-ho adjusted his stethoscope, his hands moving with a clinical professionalism that belied the explosive recognition burning in his eyes. He didn't look at her directly, focusing instead on the clipboard, his attentive focus a desperate shield. "Vital signs are stable," Junho said, his voice muffled by the light blue surgical mask. It was the same voice that had whispered to her in the dark of a hotel room a year ago, but now it was stripped of warmth, replaced with a cold, observant distance. The heavy thud of leather soles against the linoleum signaled the entrance of Kang Min-jae. The air in the room didn't just chill, it seemed to vanish. Min-jae stood at the bedside, his ruthless possessiveness radiating from him like a heat from a furnace. He didn't look at the monitors or the IV bag, he looked at Renee as if she were a piece of fine porcelain that had dared to crack. "How long, doctor?" Min-jae's voice was a low growl of absolute authority. He placed a hand on Renee's shoulder, his grip firm, a reminder of the possessive cage she called a marriage. "I have no patience for hospital bureaucracy. I want an immediate recovery. My wife belongs at home, not in a public ward." Junho finally looked up, meeting the intense, watchful gaze of the man whose reputation turned the city's streets to ice. The power imbalance was staggering. On one side, a healer with a forbidden history. On the other, a lethal enforcer who viewed the world in terms of assets and enemies. She has a minor concussion and significant bruising, Mr. Kang, Junho replied, his controlled body language barely hiding the tremor in his fingers as he reached out to check Renee's pulse. Renee felt Junho's fingers on her wrist. The contact was brief, a mere clinical necessity, but the vulnerability and emotional tension was so thick she feared Min-jae would smell it. Junho's touch was steady, yet she could feel the inner conflict vibrating through him. He was a man of medicine trapped in a high-tension game of shadows. Min-jae leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he watched the doctor's hands. Observation, he repeated, the word sounding like a threat. Then observe carefully, doctor, because if she isn't back to herself by morning, I will find a hospital that employs more competent staff. As Min-jae turned to bark orders at his guards in the hallway, Renee and Junho shared a split-second locked gaze. It was a silent plea for silence, a forbidden connection forged in fear. The clinical mask was holding for now, but in the well-lit reality of the ward, the shadows were already beginning to bleed through. The door to the private room didn't just close, it sealed with the finality of a vault. Two of Min-jae's enforcers, men with stern expressions and bulk that made the spacious VIP suite feel claustrophobic, took their positions. One stood by the door, arms crossed, while the other remained at the foot of the bed, his intense, watchful gaze tracking every flicker of the medical monitors. Renee lay trapped in the well-lit silence, the white medical gown feeling thinner with every passing second. When Dr. Han Jun-ho returned for the evening rounds, the atmosphere was thick with suffocating suspense. He entered with his head down, clutching a tablet and a physical medical chart as if they were shields. The guard by the bed didn't move an inch, his shadow falling over Renee's legs. Junho's clinical professionalism was being tested to its absolute limit. He was no longer just a doctor, but a man walking through a minefield. I need to check the patient's neurological response, Junho said, his voice a low, resonant hum muffled by his mask. He didn't look at the guard, but the controlled body language of his shoulders betrayed a deep-seated inner conflict. He stepped to the side of the bed, leaning over Renee. In the proximity and quiet intimacy of the examination, their locked gazes became a desperate, silent dialogue. "Don't say a word," her eyes pleaded. "I can't breathe with them watching," his replied. Junho clicked a penlight, the beam momentarily blinding her, but it provided a split second of cover. As he leaned in to check her pupils, his hand brushed against hers on the bedsheet. It wasn't a caress, but a frantic flicker of recognition, a reminder of the forbidden history that now felt like a death sentence. Pupillary response is sluggish, Junho noted aloud for the guard's benefit, but his eyes stayed fixed on Renee's. He turned the medical chart toward her, ostensibly to show her a calculated recovery plan, but his thumb was pointedly resting over a specific handwritten note in the margins. It wasn't a diagnosis, it was a time, 0200, underlined twice. Renee felt a surge of vulnerability and emotional tension. He was planning to return when the shifts changed, when the absolute authority of Min-jae's presence might be at its weakest. She gave a microscopic nod, a resolute signal that she understood the high-stakes risk he was taking. The guard stepped closer, his boots creaking on the linoleum. "Is there a problem, doctor?" Junho snapped the chart shut, his icy composure returning just in time. "Just ensuring the Mrs. Kang receives the polished care her husband demands," he replied, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned and walked out, leaving Renee alone in the possessive cage of the room. The clinical mask had held for another hour, but as she watched the red light of the heart monitor blink in the dark, she knew the guarded secrets between them were a ticking bomb. The following afternoon, the VIP wing was eerily quiet, the clinical professionalism of the hospital staff strained under the weight of the men in dark suits stationed at every exit. Kang Min-jae sat in a leather armchair by the window, his polished danger a sharp contrast to the sterile white-walled room.
He wasn't looking at Renee, who remained calm and still on the bed. He was staring at the closed door with an intense, watchful gaze that made the air feel heavy with restrained danger. When the door finally opened, Dr. Han Jun-ho entered, flanked by the usual shadows. His attentive focus was pinned to the tablet in his hand, but as he approached the bed, his eyes inadvertently darted toward Renee for a fraction of a second too long. It was a flicker of recognition, a microscopic slip in his clinical mask, but to a man like Min Jae, who survived on the calculated investigation of human weakness, it was as loud as a gunshot. Min Jae didn't move, but his controlled body language shifted into something predatory. "You are very thorough, doctor," Min Jae remarked, his voice a low, resonant hum that carried a hidden edge. "You check her vitals with a precision I've rarely seen. It's almost as if you have a personal investment in her recovery." Junho's hand hesitated over the IV line. The inner conflict was visible in the sudden tension of his jaw. "I treat all my patients with the same level of care, Mr. Kang, especially those under the protection of a man with your reputation." Min Jae stood slowly, his firm stance suggesting absolute authority. He walked toward the doctor, stopping only when he was close enough to see the beads of sweat forming at Junho's hairline. The power imbalance in the room was suffocating. "Is that so? Because I find it curious that a doctor of your standing, with such a clean record, has spent time in the same district where my wife was exploring a year ago." Renee felt the vulnerability and emotional tension reach a breaking point. Her neutral expression remained, but her pulse spiked on the monitor, a rhythmic, telltale betrayal. The sharp beep, beep, beep filled the room, a digital confession of her fear. Min Jae's intense gaze shifted from the doctor to the monitor and then to Renee. A slow, ruthless smile spread across his face. "It seems my wife's heart agrees with me, doctor. There is something in this room that isn't on the charts." He turned to his lead enforcer without looking away from Junho. "Bring me everything on Dr. Han, every school he attended, every hotel he visited, and every woman he's touched in the last 12 months. I want a calculated history of this man before the sun sets." As the enforcers stepped out to begin the investigation, the well-lit room felt like it was closing in. The forbidden history was no longer a secret, it was a scent, and Min Jae was on the trail. The opportunity arrived during the shift change, a frantic 30-second window when the absolute authority of Min Jae's presence was momentarily replaced by the muffled voices of guards arguing in the hallway. The heavy door clicked shut, and the well-lit room felt suddenly dangerously small. Dr. Han Jun-ho didn't approach the foot of the bed this time. He moved to the side, his clinical professionalism discarded like a useless weight. He lowered his surgical mask, revealing a face etched with inner conflict and a raw, vulnerable desperation that Renee hadn't seen since that forbidden night.
"Renee, listen to me," he whispered, his voice a low, resonant hum thick with emotional gravity. He checked the door over his shoulder, his controlled body language now a mask of alert readiness. Renee sat up slightly, the white medical gown rustling against the sheets. Her neutral expression finally shattered, replaced by the vulnerability and emotional tension she had been suppressed for hours. "You need to leave, Junho. You have no idea what he's capable of. His calculated investigation won't stop until he finds a reason to destroy you." "I know exactly who Kang Min Jae is," Junho countered, his intense gaze locking onto hers with a resolute fire. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from her skin, a forbidden connection that crackled in the silence. "I knew the moment I saw his name on your insurance forms. But I didn't forget, Renee. I didn't forget the way you looked at me in that hotel room, like I was the only thing keeping you from drowning." Renee felt a surge of quiet strength mixed with a paralyzing fear. That night was a mistake, a moment of weakness because I couldn't bear the possessive cage for one more second. It wasn't a mistake for me.
he whispered, his attentive focus narrowing as the footsteps returned to the hallway. He leaned in closer, the proximity and quiet intimacy of the moment peaking as he pressed a small folded piece of paper into her palm. He's looking into my past, but he doesn't know I've been watching him too. I'm not just a doctor, Renee. I'm the only one who can get you out of here before his ruthless grip becomes permanent. The handle of the door turned, and Junho snapped his mask back into place with calculated control, his clinical mask resetting in an instant. By the time the guards stepped back into the room, Junho was once again the professional healer, staring at a monitor with icy composure. But Renee felt the weight of the paper in her hand, a guarded secret that promised either a future she never dared imagine or a swift, lethal end for them both. The well-lit silence of the VIP wing was shattered not by a voice, but by the dull, heavy thud of a suppressed gunshot echoing from the stairwell. The clinical professionalism of the ward evaporated in an instant as the hospital's power surged and died, plunging the room into a terrifying, restrained danger. Red emergency lights flickered to life, casting long, rhythmic shadows across Renee's bed. Min Jae's guards reacted with lethal readiness, drawing their weapons and moving into a protective formation near the door. But the attack was coordinated and ruthless. A rival faction, sensing a moment of vulnerability in the chairman's presence, had turned the sanctuary of the hospital into a kill zone. The sound of shattered glass and rapid-fire shouting drifted through the vents, signaling that the underworld's reach had finally extended into the one place Renee thought was safe. The door to the room burst open, but it wasn't a hitman. Dr. Jun Han-yo lunged inside, his white lab coat stained with dust, and his controlled body language frantic. He ignored the weapons pointed at his chest, his attentive focus locked entirely on Renee. "They've breached the main elevator," Junho shouted over the rising chaos. He looked at the lead guard, his inner conflict replaced by a resolute authority that even the enforcer couldn't ignore. "If you stay here, you're trapped. There's a service freight lift through the surgical prep room. I'm the only one with the keycard access." The lead guard hesitated, his absolute authority wavering as a grenade detonated in the hallway. "Move," the guard barked. Junho didn't wait. He moved to the side of the bed. His proximity provided a brief moment of silent salvation as he helped Renee slide into a wheelchair. Her neutral expression was gone, replaced by a heart-pounding fear as she felt the vulnerability and emotional tension of being caught in the crosshairs. As they raced through the dark corridors, the clinical mask of the hospital was stripped away, revealing the raw, explosive violence of the world she had married into. Bullets chewed into the doorframes behind them. Junho pushed the wheelchair with a firm stance, his professionalism now manifesting as a desperate drive to keep her alive. He steered her into a narrow, shadow-filled supply closet just as a group of armed men swept past the main intersection. In the cramped, intimate darkness, Renee could hear Junho's ragged breathing. He wasn't just a doctor anymore. He was her shield. For the first time, the forbidden history between them felt like a lifeline instead of a weight. As the underworld's reach closed in, Junho leaned down, his voice a low, resonant hum of unspoken promise. "I told you I would get you out. Keep your head down and don't let go." The chaos of the hospital siege had been quelled, leaving a suffocating suspense in its wake as the VIP suite was reclaimed by Min Jae's men. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and copper, but the restrained danger radiating from Kang Min Jae was far more lethal than any stray bullet. He sat at the edge of Renee's bed, not as a concerned husband, but as a lethal enforcer who had just finished a hunt. In his hand, he held a small translucent evidence bag containing a fragment of evidence, a delicate silver earring found lodged in the seat of a car that had been traced to a hotel in the Itaewon district exactly 1 year ago. "I've always admired your quiet strength, Renee. Min-jae said, his voice a low, resonant hum that made the vulnerability and emotional tension in the room spike. He held the bag up to the light, the silver glinting like a mirrored high-end trap. But I find it curious that your favorite pair of earrings was missing one piece until my men searched the room of a certain clinical professional this morning.
Renee's neutral expression remained, but her steady posture felt like it was crumbling from within. The calculated investigation had reached its breaking point. The digital trail of the hotel's valet logs had been the spark, but this physical piece of her forbidden history was the wildfire. At the foot of the bed, Dr. Han Jun-ho stood in a firm, composed stance, though his inner conflict was etched into the tight line of his jaw. He knew the absolute authority Min-jae possessed meant that a trial was already over. This was merely the sentencing. The doctor's apartment was very well lit and organized, Min-jae continued, standing slowly to bridge the proximity between them. He leaned over Renee, his ruthless possessiveness a heavy weight. But he kept this in a velvet box, a memento of a night when my wife decided to play at being someone else. Tell me, doctor, does your clinical mask cover the taste of my wife's skin? The explosive silence that followed was a physical blow. Jun-ho's attentive focus shifted to Renee, a locked gaze that contained a silent salvation and a final apology. The power imbalance was now absolute. Min-jae's stern expression twisted into a mask of ruthless clarity as he signaled to the enforcers by the door. The hospital is no longer a place of healing, Min-jae declared, his absolute authority final. It has become a mausoleum for your secrets. Renee felt the vulnerability of her position peak as she realized that the fragment of evidence had stripped away her last defense. The calculated investigation was over, and as Min-jae's hand tightened on her arm, she knew they had reached the breaking point where survival would require a transformation more drastic than she had ever imagined. The dining hall of the Kang estate was a mirrored high-end theater of intimidation, where the absolute authority of the Mafia underworld met the polished elegance of a formal dinner. Renee sat at the center, her white medical gown replaced by a silk dress that felt like a shroud, her white knuckle grip hidden beneath the table. Across from her, Dr. Han Jun-ho sat in a high-backed velvet chair, his clinical mask now with thin, trembling veil over his terror. Between them stood Min-jae, the master of this high-tension ceremony, pouring wine with a calculated control that was more terrifying than a drawn blade. "A toast," Min-jae began, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the fine crystal. "To the man who saved my wife during the siege. A doctor's hands are truly his most valuable asset. Wouldn't you agree, Jun-ho?" The proximity and quiet intimacy of the setting was a lie. Every clink of silver against porcelain sounded like a heart-pounding warning. Min-jae moved behind Jun-ho, placing a heavy hand on Jun-ho's shoulder, a gesture of ruthless possessiveness that forced Jun-ho to stiffen his firm stance. "I was looking at the hotel records again," Min-jae continued, his intense, watchful gaze fixed on Renee's neutral expression. "The night my wife's earring went missing. It's a beautiful hotel, soundproof walls, disorganized security, the perfect place for a clinical professional to lose himself." Renee felt the vulnerability and emotional tension peak as Min-jae pulled a steak knife from the table, testing its edge with a composed detachment. The power imbalance in the room was suffocating. He wasn't asking questions, he was performing a psychological torture session, dissecting their forbidden history while they were forced to smile and eat. "Tell me, doctor, does your clinical mask cover the taste of my wife's skin?" Min-jae whispered, leaning down until his lips were inches from Jun-ho's ear. "Did you think about me when you touched her? Did you wonder what a man like me does to those who steal from my private collection?" Jun-ho's inner conflict finally broke. He looked at Renee, a locked gaze filled with silent salvation and the raw truth of his fear.
I did my job, Mr. Kang, he managed to choke out, his controlled body language failing as his hands began to shake. Min Jae's stern expression didn't change, but he drove the knife deep into the mahogany table, inches from Junho's hand. The explosive violence of the gesture shattered the social pretense. You did more than your job, he hissed, and tonight we see if those valuable hands can still perform surgery after they've been broken. The interrogation had reached its zenith. Renee watched in complete vulnerability as the guards moved in from the shadows. The dinner was over, and the clinical mask had finally been stripped away, leaving only the lethal reality of Min Jae's vengeance. The sirens of the city were drowned by the explosive thunder of the estate's security gates being breached, but the real war had returned to the hospital, where the evidence of their forbidden history was still being scrubbed from the ledgers. Min Jae had moved the high-tension confrontation back to the VIP ward, a place he now viewed as a mausoleum for his wife's infidelity. The clinical professionalism of the corridors was replaced by the raw, ruthless violence of a man who had finally confirmed his betrayal. As the rival faction, sensing the power imbalance caused by Min Jae's obsession, launched a final desperate siege on the wing, the ward became a literal battlefield. Bullets shattered the mirrored high-end glass of the observation rooms, and smoke filled the air, turning the well-lit sanctuary into a shadow-filled maze of restrained danger. Renee stood in the center of the chaos, her steady posture finally breaking as she watched Min Jae pin Junho against a blood-stained wall. Min Jae's absolute authority was a terrifying sight. His lethal enforcer persona had completely consumed the husband she once knew. He held a weapon to Junho's throat, his intense, watchful gaze flickering with explosive jealousy.
He saved your life so he could keep what belongs to me, Min Jae roared over the sound of a detonating flashbang. Choose, Renee. Do I end the clinical professional now, or do you come back to the possessive cage and watch him suffer for every second of that night? Junho looked at her, his white lab coat torn and his inner conflict replaced by a resolute calm. He didn't beg for his life. Renee, don't let him own your fear anymore, he choked out, his voice a low, resonant hum of silent salvation. The siege is the distraction. The service lift is still open. Run. The vulnerability and emotional tension reached its breaking point. Renee looked at the man who offered a polished danger and a life of silk-lined imprisonment, then at the man who had offered her a single night of humility and warmth. The transformation began in that locked gaze. She realized that staying with Min Jae wasn't loyalty, it was a slow death. With a quiet strength she had kept hidden for years, Renee grabbed a discarded surgical tray and swung it with calculated control into the emergency fire alarm, triggering a blinding white foam and a deafening strobe. In the high-tension confusion, she didn't run away, she ran toward Junho. She shoved Min Jae back, the power imbalance shifting just enough for her to grab the doctor's hand. I'm choosing my soul, she hissed at the husband she no longer recognized. As they dived into the shadow-filled freight lift, the doors hissed shut on Min Jae's ruthless roar. The hospital was no longer a place of healing, but the forge where Renee's new life was being hammered into existence. The cold night air of Seoul rushed into the freight elevator as the doors groaned open at the sub-basement level, a stark contrast to the suffocating suspense of the ward above. Renee stepped out into the shadow-filled parking garage, her steady posture finally under her own command. Beside her, Dr. Han Junho leaned against the concrete wall, his inner conflict giving way to a vulnerable relief. He looked at her, his attentive focus searching for the woman he had once held in a hotel room, but the woman standing before him now possessed a dignified presence that had been forged in the fire of the hospital siege. The service exit leads to the subway tunnels, Junho whispered, his voice a low, resonant hum of unspoken promise. My car is a few blocks away. We can leave this city, Renee. We can find a place where the underworld's reach can't find us. Renee looked at his clinical hands, the hands that had healed her and the hands she had once craved, then looked toward the distant sirens of Min Jae's encroaching empire.
She felt the proximity and quiet intimacy of Junho's offer, but a new identity was taking root in her heart. She realized that trading one possessive cage for a life on the run with another man was just a different kind of vulnerability. "No, Junho," she said, her voice carrying a quiet strength that brooked no argument. Her neutral expression had evolved into a resolute clarity. "If I go with you, Min Jae will never stop hunting you, and I will never stop being a passive captive of my own fear." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, folded paper he had given her, the one containing his calculated escape route, and handed it back to him. The power imbalance that had defined her life for years was finally leveled. "You saved my life tonight, and for that I am grateful," she murmured, her locked gaze conveying a final, serious and thoughtful goodbye. "But I need to save my own soul now. I'm leaving both of you behind." Before he could protest, Renee turned and walked into the well-lit fog of the early morning. She didn't head for the car or the tunnels. She moved toward the crowded transit hub where a 45-year-old Black American woman could become invisible among the thousands. She discarded the white medical gown of her victimhood, stepping into the future she never dared imagine with a poised, dominant presence. Behind her, the mausoleum of her marriage was crumbling. Ahead of her, the world was wide, silent, and finally hers. As the first train of the morning rattled into the station, Renee Williams disappeared into the light, a maid who endures no longer, but a woman who had passed her final examination and chosen herself. If this story stayed with you longer than the video itself, you might belong here. Subscribe and keep walking these stories with us.